Carl Panzram was born on June 28, 1891, on a struggling farm in East Grand Forks, Minnesota. His parents, John and Matilda, were German immigrants who had come to America looking for a better life, but instead found punishing poverty. Carl eventually had 5 brothers and 1 sister. By his own later admission, his siblings grew into honest, hard-working farmers, while he did not. The early years of his life were defined by 2 things above all: relentless physical labor and violence. Matilda, furious that her children couldn't work the fields during school hours, forced them instead to work in the fields through the night. Carl later recalled that he would receive approximately 2 hours of sleep before being forced back up for school. Household punishments ranged from being bound in chains to being denied food for extended periods. When Carl was approximately 7 years old, his father John abandoned the family without warning, walking off the farm one day and never returning. With John gone, the family's already fragile stability collapsed entirely. The remaining older brothers took over both the labor and the discipline, and Carl, as the youngest and most defiant, bore the brunt of it. He was beaten continuously, sometimes for no reason at all. He was later quoted saying, "Everybody thought it was all right to deceive me, lie to me, and kick me around whenever they felt like it, and they felt like it pretty regular." By age 8, he had already been arrested once for public drunkenness. By age 11 in 1902, his criminal activity escalated. He broke into a neighbor's home and stole various items, including a revolver. His brothers discovered the theft almost immediately and beat him unconscious. He was arrested, charged with burglary, and as part of a plea agreement, a judge sent him to the Minnesota State Training School in Red Wing. He arrived at the school on October 11th, 1903. It housed roughly 300 boys between the ages of 10 and 20, situated in a setting that looked from the outside like a straight-lined and respectable Christian institution. However, behind closed doors, it was something else entirely. The institution operated under little to no outside supervision, a condition that allowed systematic abuse of those in its care. From the moment Carl arrived, the conditions were degrading. He was brought immediately into a reception office where a male staff member stripped him naked and asked him explicit questions that seemed far from appropriate. It was, as Carl wrote decades later, an omen of what was to come. The beatings were administered with wooden planks, thick leather straps, whips, and heavy paddles. Because Carl had received almost no schooling on the farm and could barely read, he was beaten for this as well. The boys at the school referred to the room where the worst beatings were held as the paint shop. The reason was that everyone who stepped out of it was painted in bruises and blood. Alongside the abuse, the students received Bible lessons, hymns, and moral teaching delivered by the same men who beat them. For someone who had already learned to distrust adults, watching men invoke the name of God while administering torture created a permanent, irreconcilable contempt. Religion, in Carl's mind, became synonymous with hypocrisy and cruelty. He said, "I may not have accomplished much in a scholarly way while there, but I learned how to become a first-class liar." And then came the beginnings of degeneracy. As the mistreatment compounded month by month, Carl's mind settled into a new permanent state. He understood that what was being done was unjust, and so he wanted to get revenge. But in his twisted understanding, his idea of revenge meant inflicting the same pain on everyone else. He even said that anyone would do when the situation became dire enough. On the night of July 7th, 1905, he rigged a simple device timed to start a fire after he had returned to his dorm room. The fire consumed the school's workshop entirely, burning it to the ground. He lay in his bunk and listened, and he was never caught or charged. Later that same year, he appeared before the school's parole board and told them precisely what they wanted to hear, that he was reformed, repentant, and grateful. He was released and declared a success of the institution. Carl later said, "I was certainly reformed all right. I had been taught by Christians how to be a hypocrite, and I had learned more about stealing, lying, hating, burning, and killing." That winter, his mother Matilda came to collect him at the age of 14, but upon seeing him, she stated that she essentially did not recognize the boy. Carl was withdrawn, cold, and gave off a vibe of disrespect. One of Carl's brothers had recently drowned, and his mother's health was deteriorating, creating a situation where she did not have the energy for a difficult child. Carl returned to the farm and attempted briefly to resume some semblance of a normal life. but he just couldn't. He harbored resentment toward his mother, whom he later wrote he had once respected, but whose feelings had, quote, turned from that to distrust, dislike, disgust, and from there it was very simple for my feelings to turn into positive hatred. Before actually leaving Red Wing, Carl had formalized a thought in his mind saying, I fully decided when I left there just how I would live my life. I made up my mind that I would rob, burn, destroy, and kill everywhere I went and everybody I could as long as I lived. Carl enrolled in another school but quickly became involved in a conflict with a teacher who whipped him on multiple occasions. One day, he obtained a handgun and brought it to school with the intention of killing the teacher in front of his classmates. During a physical struggle, the gun fell out of his pants and onto the classroom floor. He was expelled and returned to the farm. 2 weeks later, he hopped on a freight train and left Minnesota permanently. He was thrust into the world of men, boys, and transients who lived in freight cars and along rail lines across the country, begging, stealing, and surviving by any means available. It was a world without safety or rules, and Carl adapted quickly. He stole food, picked pockets, and committed petty burglaries in the towns and cities where trains stopped. Shortly after leaving Minnesota, while riding a lumber car west out of Montana, Carl encountered 4 men who offered him a place to stay. They told him they could buy him nice clothes and give him a warm place to sleep. Before long, their intent became clear. Carl was brutally violated by all 4 men, one after the other. He said, I cried, I begged and pleaded for mercy, pity, and sympathy, but nothing I could say or do could sway them from their purpose. I left that box a sadder, sicker, but wiser boy. Shortly after the assault, he was arrested in Butte, Montana for burglary and received a 1-year sentence at the Montana State Reform School at Miles City. By now, still around the age of 15, his body had grown significantly, weighing in at nearly 180 pounds. In addition to his new frame and stature, Carl carried himself with a new air of confidence. One school guard singled him out early, nagging and provoking him until Carl decided to act. He found a heavy wooden plank outside a workshop and, when the guard turned his back, bludgeoned him across the top of the head with it. For this, he received multiple severe beatings from the staff and was placed under closer surveillance. Instead of deterring him, it only reinforced his conviction that violence was the only language institution spoke. In 1907, Carl and a fellow inmate named Jimmy Benson escaped from the reform school together. The two stole several handguns in a nearby town and traveled east, robbing and burning as they went. The duo took a particular interest in targeting churches. They would rob churches and then set them ablaze, town after town. They traveled through Glendive, Crane, Sidney, and other small Montana towns, working their way east toward Minnesota. By the time they reached Fargo, North Dakota, they were each carrying 2 handguns and hundreds of dollars in stolen cash. They split up in Fargo, and Carl drifted west alone under the alias Jefferson Baldwin. In December of that same year, Carl found himself in Helena, Montana, a rough frontier city populated by fur traders and fishermen. One night in a local tavern, a U.S. Army recruiter gave a speech. Drunk and directionless, Carl lied about his age and enlisted on the spot. He was assigned to Company A, 6th Infantry, at Fort William Henry Harrison in western Montana. On his first day in uniform, he was brought up on charges of insubordination for refusing a work detail. Over the following months, he was jailed repeatedly for issues including being constantly drunk, impossible to manage, and incapable of accepting orders. In April 1908, he broke into the quartermaster's building and stole clothing and supplies valued at about $90. He was attempting to go AWOL with the stolen items when military police arrested him. He faced a general court-martial on April 20th, 1908, before a tribunal of 9 military officers. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of larceny and received a sentence including dishonorable discharge and 3 years of hard labor at a federal facility. His sentence was reviewed and approved by William Taft, then Secretary of War and future President of the United States. Carl was shackled, loaded into a cattle car with other military prisoners, given no food or water for the 1,000-mile journey, and transported to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He arrived in May 1908. The new section of Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary was an imposing fortress, built by inmate labor on over 1,500 acres and surrounded by 40-foot concrete walls that extended 20 feet underground. Because prison authorities did not know Carl was only 16 years old, he was processed as a full adult and received the same treatment as any grown man. The regimen was brutal by any standard. Prisoners stood in formation every morning regardless of the weather. A strict code of silence was enforced, and any infraction meant a whipping and solitary confinement. Carl was chained to a 50-pound metal ball that he had to carry wherever he went, including when he slept. He was assigned to break rocks in a quarry for 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. He attempted to escape, but failed. He then burned down one of the prison workshops, causing over $100,000 in damage. As a result of the labor, his body grew immensely. He was beaten repeatedly, subjected to the same culture of institutional cruelty he had experienced at Red Wing and Miles City, but now at adult scale. When he was released in August 1910 at the age of 19, he said, "When I left there, all the good that may have been in me had been kicked and beaten out of me." Carl had no direction on where to go and no one to fall back on. He drifted south through Kansas and Texas, then southwest, and eventually into California, still operating under the alias Jeff Baldwin. He set fires to barns, sheds, fences, snow sheds, fields, and anything else he could ignite. He shot at farmhouse windows from a distance and fired at cattle and horses in open fields for the pleasure of it. He described riding the trains across vast stretches through Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and Utah, and violating men he encountered along the way. Carl said, "Whenever I met one that wasn't too rusty looking, I would make him raise his hands and drop his pants. I wasn't very particular either. Old and young, tall and short, white and black." In the summer of 1911, he was arrested in Fresno, California for stealing a bicycle. He was sentenced to 6 months in the county jail, but escaped after 30 days. He retrieved several stolen guns he had buried outside of town before his arrest, jumped a freight train heading northwest, and almost immediately committed another crime aboard the train. While in a boxcar outside of Fresno, he encountered a railroad cop who climbed into the car intending to extort money from the men inside. Carl produced his pistol, robbed the officer of his watch and cash, and then assaulted him at gunpoint. He then forced 2 other men in the car to also violate the officer while he held them with his gun. Afterward, he threw all 3 men off the moving train. He continued north to Oregon, where he worked briefly as a seasonal logger along the Columbia River. In 1913, operating under a new alias, Jack Allen, Carl was arrested in the Dalles, Oregon for highway robbery, assault, and sodomy. He broke out of that jail within 2 months. He was subsequently arrested again in Harrison, Idaho as Jeff Davis. During his first night in custody there, he set fire to one of the jail buildings, and several inmates, including himself, escaped in the chaos. He fled north through the grove of ancient cedars and across the Bitterroot Mountains into western Montana. In the small town of Chinook, Montana, he was arrested again for burglary and sentenced to 1 year at the Montana State Prison at Deer Lodge. This facility was equipped with guards in turrets who were authorized to shoot escaping prisoners on sight. He was admitted on April 27, 1913, where he began assaulting fellow inmates, using his size and reputation to dominate weaker prisoners. By sheer luck, he eventually ran into his old reform school companion, Jimmy Benson, who was serving a 10-year stretch for robbery. Together, they planned another escape, but Benson was transferred at the last moment and the plan fell apart. On November 13, 1913, Carl escaped from Deer Lodge alone. Barely a week later, in the town of Three Forks, Montana, he was arrested again for burglary. He received a 1-year addition to his sentence for the escape and was returned to the same prison. He served out the remainder of his sentence and was released on March 30, 1915. He was given $5, a set of clothes, and a bus ticket to the nearest town. In the following years, Carl continued his typical behavior and served time in various institutions as a result. By 1920, at the age of 28, Carl's crimes were on the brink of reaching a new level. At the time, he had settled into New Haven, Connecticut, where he was able to rob what he referred to as fat houses. These were older homes often owned by wealthier families. In August 1920, he identified one such house on 113 Whitney Avenue, a 3-story colonial that looked, in his words, like the home of an aristocrat. He broke in through a window and worked his way through the bedrooms. Inside one room, he found a large quantity of jewelry, stock bonds, and a .45 caliber Colt M1911. The name on the bonds was William H. Taft, the same man who, in 1908, had personally approved Carl's 3-year sentence at the disciplinary barracks as Secretary of War. In 1920, Taft was no longer president and was now a professor of law at Yale University in New Haven. Carl loaded everything he could carry and escaped through the same window he had entered. He made his way down to the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where he sold most of the jewelry and bonds on the black market. He wrote later that he netted approximately $3,000 in cash from the sale, keeping several items for himself, including the firearm. He had harbored a specific grudge against Taft for over a decade, and the pistol in particular held meaning for him. It became the weapon he would use to murder numerous people over the following weeks and months. With the money, Carl purchased a small yacht that he named the Akista, registering it under the alias John O'Leary. He sailed the boat north up the East River, through Long Island Sound, and up the coast. Along the way, he broke into dozens of boats moored along the shore, stealing liquor, firearms, equipment, and cash, including a 50-foot vessel called the Barbara II, owned by the Marsiliot family of Norfolk, Virginia. He eventually moored the Akista at the New Haven Yacht Club, where he stayed for a time before relocating. Conveniently, Carl noticed an abundance of potential victims in the merchant sailors who frequented the area. These were men passing through with no fixed address, no one checking on them, and they had no real connection to any community. He approached them with a simple offer: work on his yacht for guaranteed pay. Once aboard the Akista, anchored off the secluded city island, he fed his guests, got them drunk on stolen Prohibition liquor, waited until they were deep asleep, then retrieved the gun and shot each man in the head. He tied a heavy rock to each body, loaded it into his skiff, and rowed east through Long Island Sound to a point that was infamous for the drowning of American prisoners by British troops during the Revolutionary War. It was here that he dumped the bodies. He made the trip into Manhattan every day or two, selected a new target from the South Street waterfront, brought him back to City Island, and repeated the process. After several weeks, residents of City Island began to take notice of Carl, who was known as Captain O'Leary locally, and his peculiarly high turnover of crew members. Carl took note of the growing suspicion and decided to change the location. He sailed south along the Jersey coast with his last 2 intended passengers aboard, heading for Long Beach Island, intending to kill them at sea. In late August 1920, a sudden and violent storm struck the coast, and the Akista was destroyed against the rocks. Carl was thrown into the surf and was barely able to swim to shore. The 2 men aboard also made it to the beach and fled inland into the New Jersey farmlands. Carl watched them go and did not pursue. He had lost the yacht, but the 2 survivors apparently never reported the encounter to authorities. After losing the yacht, Carl spent the fall of 1920 in the Connecticut-New York area, continuing to commit burglaries. In October, the Stamford Daily Advocate reported the arrest of a John O'Leary for being armed with a handgun. He was released and, within months, had stowed away on a ship. By early 1921, he had landed in Angola, stating that he needed to put distance between himself and American law enforcement. In Luanda, the largest coastal city of Angola, Carl secured employment with the Sinclair Oil Company as a foreman on an oil drilling rig. Shortly after his arrival, he encountered a 12-year-old boy wandering the company grounds. He lured him inside and assaulted him before killing him with a rock. Following the murder, Carl left Luanda and traveled several hundred miles south along the Atlantic coast to Libido Bay. He lived there for several weeks inside the local fishing village. Word traveled fast along the coast, and locals soon suspected him of the Luanda murder, but nothing could be proven. He kept a low profile and waited. Several weeks later, Carl devised his next scheme: Crocodile hides were a premium commodity in the Congo basin, especially with European buyers. He advertised that he needed 6 men to accompany him on a crocodile hunting expedition up the river. He formed his crew, secured a large dugout canoe, and paddled upriver into the jungle. As the canoe moved deeper into the jungle, away from any settlement or witness, Carl shot each of the 6 men before any could react. He then fired a second shot into each of the victims as they lay in the bottom of the canoe. He fed all 6 bodies to the crocodiles in the river before rowing back to Libido Bay alone. He knew immediately that he had to leave. Dozens of people had watched him hire the 6 men and depart. He paddled north up the Congo River, passed through a settlement called Point Banana, and continued north along the coast toward the Gold Coast, or present-day Ghana. He robbed several farmers along the way and collected enough money for passage to the Canary Islands. From there, broke and unable to find any profitable ventures, he stowed away on a ship bound for Lisbon, Portugal. He arrived in Lisbon to find that Angolan authorities had shared information with Portuguese police about his crimes, and law enforcement there was actively watching for him. He managed to conceal himself from police long enough to locate another outgoing vessel and stow away a second time, this time on a ship headed back across the Atlantic to the United States. By the summer of 1922, Carl was back on American soil, having murdered 7 people in Africa and 10 aboard his yacht. Within weeks of his return to the US, Carl traveled to Hartford, Connecticut, where he brought Taft's M1911 to the Maxim Silent Firearms Company to have a silencer fitted to the barrel. When he test-fired the suppressor, he was disappointed. The .45 caliber pistol was still loud enough to attract attention, and the silencer failed to deliver the near silence he had imagined. After abandoning the silencer plan, Carl continued moving up and down the East Coast, continuing to kill boys and men as well as survive off of robberies. Between crimes, he continued to cycle through various prisons under his different aliases, serving time at Sing Sing Correctional and Clinton Correctional in New York, which is regarded as one of the harshest prisons in the state. By 1928, at the age of 36, Carl had committed 21 murders, over 1,000 acts of assault and sodomy, and thousands of burglaries, arsons, and robberies. After another stint of freedom, Carl was arrested again on August 30th, 1928, when he and 3 accomplices attempted to sell a stolen radio and jewelry to a fence. The fence had been under surveillance, and police were waiting. All 4 men were taken into custody. At booking, Carl decided to give his real name, which he had not done for over a decade. Why exactly is unclear, but whatever the reason, this set in motion the investigation that would end his freedom permanently. During the initial interrogation in Baltimore, before he was even transferred to a larger facility, Carl voluntarily began confessing to murders. He told investigators he had killed 2 young boys in New England earlier that same month, and then disclosed the killing of a 14-year-old newsboy named Alexander Luzak from Philadelphia. He was transferred to the Washington, D.C. jail to await trial on charges involving burglary and stolen goods. Within his first few days in the jail, Carl began making unsolicited remarks about killing children to guards who passed his cell. The comments were detailed enough to genuinely alarm staff, who passed them up the chain of command. Inquiries were sent to law enforcement agencies in other states, and within days, responses came back from multiple jurisdictions. Carl was wanted in connection with unsolved cases in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. The DC jail had, without intending to, landed one of the most wanted unidentified criminals in the United States. Interestingly, despite having seemingly given up on his life of crime and running from the law, Carl attempted to escape jail just weeks after being admitted. He began quietly chipping away at the concrete surrounding the metal bars of his cell window, working during the hours when guards were least likely to notice, but a fellow inmate found out and informed the warden. Carl was removed from his cell and taken to an isolated area of the facility where he was handcuffed around a thick wooden pole and a rope was tied to the handcuffs. Guards hoisted him up until only his toes were touching the floor and his arms were raised above his shoulders. He was left this way for a day and a half, while guards administered beatings at intervals throughout. He screamed at his captors, cursed his parents for having him, and announced that he would kill everyone in the building if given the chance. It was during this punishment that Carl began confessing in greater detail. He told the guards about the boys he had killed, how he did it, and where and when. This didn't appear to be an attempt at negotiation, but instead simply wanting the information to be known. By morning, the guards who had worked that night shift were exchanging the shocking accounts of what they had heard, and within days, the story reached the press. On October 28, 1928, the Washington Post published a report stating that a prisoner had confessed to the murders of several boys. Carl also stated that, quote, "If that ain't enough, I'll give you plenty more. I've been all over the world and I've seen everything but hell, and I guess I'll see that soon." Each day that passed, investigators received more. Carl was talking freely now, even assisting officers with cross-referencing his crimes with open cases. Among the jail staff at the time of Carl's arrival was a 26-year-old rookie guard named Henry Lesser. Lesser was not aggressive and did not share the contemptuous attitude most guards adopted toward Carl. One day, without any particular occasion or calculation, he gave Carl $1 to buy cigarettes and extra food from the commissary. This was a profound gesture for Carl. He went quiet for a moment and eventually thanked him, something witnesses noted as startling in itself. Over the following days, the two began to speak. Slowly, the conversations grew longer. Lesser asked questions and Carl answered them honestly and with enthusiasm. At some point, Lesser suggested that Carl write it all down, and he agreed. Lesser supplied pencil and paper, and they agreed that Carl would write 15 or so pages at a stretch and leave them between the bars of his cell during the day. Lesser would then collect them during his late-night rounds and leave fresh paper in their place. Neither man told anyone about the arrangement. If the warden had discovered it, Lesser would have been fired or worse, given Carl's growing reputation. What he wrote over the following weeks was a 20,000-word autobiographical confession that chronicled his entire life of crime in extraordinary detail. The work itself was described as very raw with large and labored handwriting, consistent with a man who had received limited formal education. He gave names of victims where he knew them, dates and locations of crimes, descriptions of jails he had been held in, names of guards and wardens who had beaten him, accounts of escapes, and a running philosophical commentary on institutions, religion, and the nature of evil. One excerpt said, "All of your police, judges, lawyers, wardens, doctors, national crime commissions, and writers have combined to find out and remedy the cause and effect of crime. With all this knowledge and power at their command, they have accomplished nothing except to make conditions worse instead of better." Of his own crimes, he was equally direct, saying, "In my lifetime, I have broken every law that was ever made by both man and God. If either had made any more, I should very cheerfully have broken them also." Lesser turned each batch of pages over to investigators after making copies. Detectives in multiple states used Carl's accounts to close open cases. Renowned psychiatrist Dr. Carl Menninger, who later reviewed the full manuscript, called it one of the most significant criminal documents ever produced. He said, "This is an unflinching self-analysis in which the prisoner spares neither himself nor society. No one can read this manuscript in its entirety without an emotional thrill." He went further in his analysis, arguing that Carl was, quote, "the logical product of our prison system. A man whose entire biography was a consequence of institutional abuse, not innate depravity." Convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life, Carl was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, arriving there on February 1st, 1929. When Warden T.B. White read him the prison rules, he coldly responded, "I'll kill the first man that bothers me." Administrators considered him too dangerous for the general population of the facility and assigned him to the laundry room. His civilian supervisor there, Robert Warnke, was known among inmates for writing up prisoners for minor infractions. Carl and Robert clashed repeatedly. In June 1929, Carl said, "He's going to die soon." Not long after, Carl picked up a 4-foot iron bar from the laundry room floor, walked to Robert's desk, and slammed it on top of his skull with full force. He continued beating Robert after he fell to the floor, ultimately killing him. He was later charged with first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Carl seemed unbothered by the result and refused to cooperate with his defense attorney during the process. Anti-death penalty organizations mounted campaigns for clemency, arguing that his history of institutional abuse warranted mercy. Carl's written response to those advocates said, "The only thanks you and your kind will ever get from me for your efforts on my behalf is that I wish you all had one neck and that I had my hands on it." He refused all appeals of his sentence and made clear in writing that he wanted to die. On the morning of September 5th, 1930, Carl Panzram was led to the gallows at Leavenworth Penitentiary. He walked quickly to the destination, and when the executioner hesitated during final preparations, Carl lost patience. His last words were, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 10 men while you're fooling around." He was hanged and pronounced dead at 39 years old. He was buried at the Leavenworth Penitentiary Cemetery with his prison number 31614 on his grave marker. This next case takes us to France and revolves around a man named Jean-Claude Romand, who was born on February 11th, 1954. He grew up in a small village by a lake with a population of approximately 1,100 residents situated close to the French-Swiss border. His father, Ime, was a respected manager of a timber operation. He was described as a quiet, hard-working man. Romand, from an early age, consciously tried to emulate his father's stoic nature, and later said that he wished to be like his father in all things. His mother, Anne-Marie, was described as frail, sickly, and anxious. Romand was convinced as a child that his mother might genuinely become ill, or even die if he burdened her with his own troubles and disappointments. He watched his classmates bring their small grievances and failures home to their parents without issue, and he concluded that he simply could not do the same. This clashed with the family's central value of always speaking the truth. Romand internalized that there were some truths too painful to be spoken aloud, that the kindest thing a person could do was to withhold information that might cause distress. He later said, "When you get caught in that endless effort not to disappoint people, the first lie leads to another, and then it's your whole life." Old neighbors, teachers, and classmates described him as a well-behaved, sweet-mannered, and eager-to-please child. He later confided that as a child, he only ever told his dog about his sadness and difficulties. He could not speak even when those who loved him would have listened. During Romand's childhood, the family constructed a house in the village and the family moved while he was still in primary school. While the family was not wealthy, Aimé garnered the respect of this new community through his reputation. Romand performed well academically from an early age, and by the time he graduated high school, most expected him to follow in his father's footsteps and go into the timber trade. The following year, he chose to pursue a forestry program and enrolled at one of France's most prestigious preparatory institutions located in Lyon. This was the first time Romand found himself among people from a decisively different social world. The preparatory classes at these elite facilities are, and remain, predominantly populated by the children of doctors, lawyers, and executives from the wealthy class. Romand was, by contrast, a rural boy from a small town and the son of a timber manager. He later described feeling exposed at this institution, surrounded by what one source characterized as the snobbish sons of the upper middle class for whom a forester was a hick. The experience had a dual effect on him. On one hand, it produced social humiliation and a profound sense of being out of place. On the other, it introduced Romand to a world of professional prestige and social elevation that he was immediately drawn to. During this preparatory year, there was a bullying incident, the specific details of which were never fully clarified. When faced with this conflict, Romand ran away. He developed what he described as, quote, a series of sinus infections that forced him to spend the remainder of that school year at his parents' home. He rarely left the house, and many described this period of his life as being a child in the body of a man. Eventually, he decided that he would not return to the preparatory program. He simply abandoned that future without telling anyone why and without any plan for what would come next. Sometime after abandoning the forestry program, Romand enrolled as a medical student at the University Claude Bernard Lyon, aka Lyon Nord. The decision to study medicine on its surface looked like ambition. However, Romand later stated that he did not care for the profession itself at all and had no interest in caring for patients. In fact, the thought of touching sick bodies repulsed him. He was drawn to medicine for two particular reasons. First, the social prestige of being a physician, and second, the presence of Florence Crowley. Florence was a distant cousin on his mother's side, and by his own admission, Romand had considered himself informally engaged to her since adolescence. She was now studying medicine at Lyon Nord, and enrolling in the same field granted him proximity to her. When his parents learned that their son wanted to pursue medicine rather than forestry, they were delighted. At Lyon Nord, Romand developed his first genuinely comfortable social life. He was quiet, modest, and not physically imposing, but he had a gift for listening and projecting a trustworthy manner that put others at ease. Florence was not immediately romantically interested in him. She was heavily focused on schoolwork and had friends who were more conventionally attractive. But Romand was persistent and her parents approved of him, and over the course of the first year, she agreed to be his girlfriend. Through her social circle, Romand met the person who would become his closest friend, Luc l'Admiral. Luc was everything Romand was not in terms of a social hierarchy. He came from a well-established family of doctors, was a natural leader, was comfortable in the bourgeois professional world that Romand was still straining to enter. Luc saw past Romand's rural awkwardness and recognized a man of intelligence and loyalty. The two men became fast friends. Romand's first year at medical school went well. Then, during the second year, something shifted. Florence withdrew from the relationship. She told him she wanted to be friends rather than serious romantic partners. Her friends at the time later maintained that she simply was not attracted to him in any deep way and had been trying to exit the relationship gradually. Romand fell into a deep depression which he hid from his circle. Shaken by the breakup, he missed one of the final exams for his second year, which functioned as the gateway to clinical placements. In the grand scope, this was a manageable setback and the university allowed students to simply reschedule for a later date. Romand rescheduled but never took the exam. It is important to note, even before this exam situation, that Romand had already demonstrated a propensity for unnecessary lying under emotional stress. On one occasion, in his first year of medical school during a night out at a bar with Florence's friends, he disappeared and then returned with a torn shirt, covered in blood, and gave a story about having been brutally beaten, kidnapped, stuffed in the trunk of a car, driven to an unknown location, beaten again, and abandoned. His friends found the account bizarre, but felt they had no reason to doubt it. Romand later said that he didn't entirely understand why he had told such a lie. The incident suggests that lying was already an involuntary reflex response to emotional and social pressure before he had consciously decided to do it. After missing his exam for the second time, he claimed to have fallen down a staircase and broken his wrist. He acknowledged that even a broken wrist wouldn't have prevented him from taking the exam. In reality, what had happened was Romand spent the morning and afternoon of the exam date lying in bed, paralyzed by some combination of depression, avoidance, and the same passive surrender he had displayed with the forestry program. Later that same night, his parents called to ask how the exam had gone, and he responded by saying he did well. 3 weeks later, in front of his friends, when the second year results were formally announced and discussed, Romand said he had passed. Nobody in his friend group double-checked and thus never realized that his name was not on the results board. To his own astonishment, the lie worked, but what followed was yet another depressive slump. He retreated to his apartment and barely left. He stopped taking care of himself and ate almost exclusively canned food and gained 45 pounds. He did not attend any classes and stopped hanging out with his friends. Weeks passed before Luc finally got through to him, arriving at his apartment and forcing himself in against Romand's wishes. Luc assumed the withdrawal had been caused by Romand's troubled relationship with Florence. Instead of telling the truth about missing his exam twice and failing, he told Luc he had been diagnosed with cancer, specifically Hodgkin's lymphoma. Luc was devastated and promised to keep the situation a secret. Romand then sent a forged doctor's certificate to the university to explain his absence. By now, he was simultaneously balancing two major lies with no end in sight. His solution was to stay enrolled at the university as a second-year medical student, indefinitely. French universities at the time had no mechanism that prevented a student from re-registering in the same year repeatedly, provided they paid the enrollment fees and submitted the paperwork. For 12 consecutive years, from 1975 until 1986, Romand registered as a second-year student each September and received a valid student ID card, which would prove to be vital for the next part of his scheme. French law at the time recognized the registered university students as exempt from paying income tax because they were not, in the eyes of the state, employed. This meant that Romand, by maintaining his student enrollment, had a legitimate legal basis for never filing a tax return as an employee. When acquaintances or officials ever raised the question of his finances, he could reference his student status as the reason he operated differently from a traditional worker. Each school year, Romand attended classes alongside other students and blended in with normal student life. He went to Paris to attend what he told his friends were the competitive training exams at the end of the year. On exam days, he would appear in the nervous crowd outside the exam hall and then not go in, leaving right as the doors opened up. The only instances he genuinely avoided were the small group clinical teaching sessions, where patients were involved and where his lack of clinical registration would have immediately set him off to officials. Everything else he attended. Luc eventually graduated as a qualified physician. Florence, having changed from medicine to pharmacology partway through their studies, earned her degree in pharmaceutical science. Yet again, Romand lied to them, stating that he too had fully completed his medical studies and passed his board exams. Eventually, this college phase of his life came to an end when a new dean of medicine began investigating the rumored phantom student who had been registered for over a decade and summoned Romand to appear in person. However, he never showed up and instead simply stopped re-enrolling. Now, this is where the details in his timeline get a bit unclear. At some point in the 1970s, Romand and Florence reconnected as a couple. And in the late 70s, Romand began claiming that he worked as a research scientist for the World Health Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. This institution was far enough away that no one in his French social circle could easily verify his actual status. As mentioned, he claimed to have a medical degree, but claiming to be a practicing clinician would have required him to appear in hospitals and have verifiable colleagues. A researcher, by contrast, worked in private and secure laboratories. Romand also gradually constructed a set of other lies that served to make his career seem more genuine. He spoke of lunches with prominent researchers and dinners with political figures. He mentioned knowing Bernard Kouchner, the founder of Doctors Without Borders and later a government minister, as a personal colleague and friend. He claimed to give lectures at the University of Dijon on Thursdays. He also claimed to have contacts with pharmaceutical executives and administrators at the highest levels. As for the financial side of his lies, Romand sold himself as a person with access to exceptional Swiss banking investments. He let it be known among family and friends that his international civil service role granted him the ability to place money into Swiss accounts, yielding an 18% annual return. This fraud expanded steadily. In 1985, he convinced his father-in-law Pierre Crollet to hand over roughly 190,000 USD in today's value for him to invest. The money went directly into Romand's personal accounts. Over the following years, he embezzled an additional 1 million USD from his own parents, his uncle, and other family. During his earlier years, he survived by selling the apartment that his parents had purchased for him during medical school. On October 23, 1988, Romand's father-in-law fell down a staircase at his home. Romand was the only witness. Pierre had recently requested that some of his invested money be returned so that he could buy a new car, a request that Romand had been stalling. As Pierre lay dying, he was reported to have uttered an accusation toward Romand before he stepped forward to place an oxygen mask on him, cutting the statement short. The authorities ruled his death an accident and Romand was never prosecuted. However, suspicion has followed this incident in the decades since, and many who have studied the case consider it a probable murder, the first in the sequence of violence Romand would commit to protect his identity and his money. In 1989, he began having an affair with a woman named Corinna Horton, the ex-wife of one of his friends. He booked 5-star hotels in Paris and purchased expensive gifts to impress her. When Corinna sold her dental practice, she received over $1 million in USD value and agreed on Roman's persuasion to allow him to invest the entire sum with his exclusive connections, and on the assurance that she could retrieve her money at any time. By the fall of 1992, Roman's fabricated world had been under a gradual, escalating strain for several years. By now, he had essentially spent all of the money he had scammed his family and friends out of. His spending had seemingly accelerated in proportion to his increasing panic. His parents' bank account had been drawn so low that the bank had flagged the overdraft and phoned his mother to report it. Roman had called her back and assured her it was a banking error and that he would see to it. Corinna was also pressing harder than she ever had. She had set a firm, non-negotiable deadline for the return of her money, and Roman had no means of meeting it. He had scheduled a dinner with her for the following weekend under the pretext of returning the funds. Roman later described himself during this period as a man who had resolved that he would take his own life before that dinner, possibly while on the phone with Corinna in an attempt to make her feel guilty. The immediate trigger for the actual unraveling was not actually caused by the finances. Instead, it was a school board dispute that seemed comically minor. Keep in mind, by this point, Roman was still balancing his relationship with Florence, with whom he had 2 children. He had joined the board of the Parents' Association at his children's private Catholic school at Florence's suggestion. The school's principal had become caught in a scandal. He had been having an affair with a teacher on the school's staff, and the board voted to remove him from his position. Roman was present at the vote, and he voted with the majority in favor of the principal's removal. When he went home that evening, however, he told Florence something different. He told her that he had voted for keeping the principal. Florence believed him, and she proceeded to support the principal publicly and campaigned for his reinstatement. One parent on the board became irritated by Roman's behavior during the dispute, and he threatened to punch him in the nose. This threat shook Roman badly. The lie came apart when Florence raised the subject with Luke. Luke knew what the vote had been after referring to the official records. When Florence learned from Luke that Roman had lied to her, her trust in her husband was completely shaken. Around this same time, the president of the school board had become curious about Roman and looked him up. The WHO, Roman's supposed employer, had a public staff directory listing all of its personnel. The president searched the directory for the name Jean-Claude Roman, but found nothing. He mentioned this to Florence on a whim during a casual conversation as a minor curiosity. She responded calmly. Whether this was genuine or an attempt at hiding her panic is unclear. What is known is that she did not immediately confront her husband about the issue. However, her trust in Roman had completely shattered. Meanwhile, in the same week, Roman's mother called him again, shaken. The bank had reported the overdraft on her account a second time, and this time enough specific information was shared that she was certain that this was no simple error. Roman reassured her again, realizing that his runway was getting shorter and shorter. In early January 1993, he made a series of purchases that seemed highly suspicious when examined as a group. He obtained a phenobarbital solution from a local pharmacy. This is a central nervous system depressant used medically as a sedative, but has the potential to be fatal if too much is consumed. He also visited a gun shop and purchased a silencer and ammo for his .22 caliber rifle that he had borrowed from his father a while back. Roman also purchased a stun gun, tear gas canisters, cans of gas, a rolling pin, and withdrew about 3,000 USD worth of cash from his bank account. Fast forward to January 9th, his 2 children, Caroline and Antoine, aged 7 and 5 respectively, had gone to bed for the night. Roman and Florence were together on the sofa in the living room. Florence's mother had called her earlier in the evening. The contents of the call was never disclosed, but it was described as a casual, routine call. What followed was an argument between Florence and Roman. Florence, who rarely drank, consumed enough wine that evening that she eventually passed out on the sofa while Roman stayed awake. At some point that night, he bashed Florence's skull in with the rolling pin he had purchased the previous day. He then washed it in the kitchen sink and put it away. He returned to the bedroom, arranged Florence's body in the bed so that she appeared to be sleeping, and went to sleep next to her. The next morning, when the kids asked where their mother was, Roman told them that she was still asleep and to let her rest. The 3 of them went downstairs together and watched morning cartoons while eating breakfast. After some time, he told his daughter he wanted to take her temperature, as she seemed a little unwell. He took her up to her bedroom, had her lie face down on the bed, and shot her in the back of the head with his rifle. He covered her with a blanket so that her brother would not immediately see what had happened when he entered the room. Then he called Antoine upstairs. He told him similarly that he wanted to take his temperature. He had him lie face down on the bed and shot him in the back of the head as well. After killing his children, Roman wrapped the rifle in a newspaper, returned it to his car, and drove over 80 kilometers across the French countryside back to the village where he had grown up to visit his parents at their home. His parents did not suspect a thing, as their son had been visiting them once a week for years. The family ate lunch together, where Roman told his father he wanted to check on a faulty air vent in one of the upstairs rooms. His father, Aimé, accompanied him. In the room, Roman positioned himself behind his father and told him to crouch down to look at the vent. As he bent down, Roman shot him in the head. He covered his father's body and went downstairs. He found his mother in the living room and shot her as well. The family dog, which had begun running frantically back and forth, was also killed. From his parents' house, he called Corinna. He told her that Bernard Kouchner was hosting a private dinner that evening at Fontainebleau and that he had arranged for both of them to attend. This was an irresistible invitation, and she agreed immediately. The drive to the dinner from the Ferney region is several hours. As the journey progressed, the route became increasingly unusual. It was more rural and isolating and did not seem consistent with a trip to a fancy private party. When Corinna began to express her impatience and confusion about the route, Roman pretended to be lost and pulled the car into a rest stop while he claimed to search for a phone number in the trunk. He told Corinna he had found something else he'd been meaning to give her, a necklace. He asked her to get out of the car and close her eyes so he could put it on her. She did as he said, and Roman immediately sprayed tear gas into her face and shot her with the stun gun. She fought back, screaming, struggling, refusing to go quietly. As she felt her consciousness slipping, she told him to think of her children, causing Roman to stop. As she stood in the dark at the rest stop, her face burning from the tear gas, Roman attempted to convince her that she had somehow initiated the altercation herself and that he had merely been defending himself. Corinna later stated that she almost allowed herself to be persuaded due to how strange and shocking the entire event was, but remained firm and was convinced that he had attacked her, not the other way around. He then attributed his behavior to his supposed illness with the lymphoma lie. At that same moment, she looked at the ground and noticed a black cord that she suspected was the so-called necklace that Roman wanted to give her. Roman drove her home in silence. 5 minutes after dropping her at her door, he called her phone from his car. He said, "Promise me not to believe it was premeditated. If I'd wanted to kill you, I'd have done it in your apartment, and I'd have killed your girls too." She did not immediately call the police. Roman returned to his home in the early hours of Monday morning and parked his car in the parking lot of a nearby shopping center. He did this because he did not want neighbors or passing friends to see a car outside and drop in. He entered his house where the bodies of his wife and kids remained. He watched television, stating that he had planned to die in a blaze after setting the house on fire with the gas he had purchased. Instead, he swallowed about 20 tablets from a bottle of sedatives separate from the phenobarbital that he had bought. These tablets had expired, which is said to decrease their effectiveness significantly. He spread gas from the cans through the upper floor of the house and over the bodies. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, he set fire to his home. He then went to the bedroom where his wife was and laid down next to her. As smoke filled the room and overcame him, he rose from the bed, made his way to the window, and opened it. The firefighters, already outside responding to the fire, heard the sound of the window and saw him. He was pulled unconscious from the house and transported by ambulance across the Swiss border to a specialized burns unit in Geneva, where he spent 3 days in a coma. When he regained consciousness, investigators immediately began unraveling the truth. The bodies in his home and at his parents' house were quickly discovered, and Corinna eventually came forward to report the attack on her. When police and journalists began contacting the WHO to verify Roman's employment, they found no record of him. He was formally charged with 5 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and extensive financial fraud. He was held in pretrial detention while investigators spent years reconstructing the totality of his fake life. His trial opened on June 25, 1996, more than 3 years after the crimes. A panel of 4 psychiatrists examined Romand over the course of the proceedings, and they could not agree on a definitive classification for his psychological profile. He did not display the open grandiosity typical of narcissistic personality, and he lacked the flat affect and social withdrawal associated with schizoid personality disorder. What nearly every evaluator agreed upon was that he showed little to no genuine remorse for the murders. He was found guilty on July 6, 1996, and sentenced to life imprisonment with a mandatory minimum of 22 years before parole eligibility. During sentencing and throughout the trial, Romand had framed the murders in an altruistic frame. He said, "I killed Florence to protect her from the intolerable pain she would have suffered after I ended my own life. Then I had to kill the children. Where would they have been without their parents?" Romand served his sentence at the Saint-Maur prison near the city of Bourges in central France. He was described as a model prisoner. He became deeply involved in the Catholic faith, attracting a steady stream of earnest Christian prison visitors who were moved by his apparent spiritual transformation. Critics pointed out that before he had been a fake physician, earning the admiration of those around him. And now he was a supposed genuine rehabilitant, earning the admiration of a new audience of religious volunteers. In April 2019, an appeals court granted Romand parole. He had served 26 years, 4 more than his mandatory minimum, and was released on June 28, 2019, when he was 65 years old. He lived in a pre-approved residence at a Benedictine monastery in the Indre region of central France. He lived under the monks' strict daily schedule, participated in agricultural work on the abbey's grounds, and resided in the guest quarters. The abbey had its own complicated history. It had sheltered Paul Touvier, a former leader of the pro-Germany Lyon militia who had hidden under the protection of Catholic monks for 45 years before his arrest in 1989. In 2022, Romand completed his 2-year electronic monitoring period and left the monastery. He no longer wears an ankle monitor and now lives quietly in a village in the same region, surviving on a monthly pension of approximately 800 euros. He is still legally required to make financial reparations to the families of his victims. His ongoing restrictions include the prohibition on contacting victims' relatives, a bar on speaking to the media about his crimes, the requirement to notify his supervising judge of any extended travel outside the region or any change of residence, and prohibitions on entering certain parts of France.